do you build a gaming PC? It's the age-old question, and it's one that causes quite a lot of stress. It's a lot of money to spend on different PC components, even if you go for a more budget-friendly system, and the last thing you want to do is break something or just find that you put it together and it doesn't work. The good news is, though, you've got me, and this is the single video that we've ever done. Doesn't really make any sense. This is definitely the best video we've ever done to give you the clearest possible guide through all of the ins and the outs, all of the intricacies, all of the tiny little pins, and we're going to show you exactly why everything we have here works together. We'll be talking about compatibility, but we'll be showing you as in clearest detail as possible how to put everything in all of the relative places, how to do so without damaging anything or making any mistakes, and obviously to helping you get the best possible rig possible. We've actually made a couple of little mistakes in here that will be really easy to make, and we're going to show you exactly what they are and how to prevent them in your build and just get the best possible gaming PC. I'm also going to say as well that whilst we have chosen parts that go really well together as well, we're also going to leave links down in the description below, not only to current pricing, but also to some parts from other different price points as well, because obviously not everyone wants to spend, I think this one was about £1,600, but as you'll see, we could do this for as low as like £1,200, £1,250. If you want to spend more, you want to spend less, obviously, we've got loads of different recommendations. You can find those all listed down below. But actually, speaking of PC parts, this video is proudly sponsored by Overclockers UK in the UK. And essentially, Overclockers are one of the best places to go for PC parts. They have such an enormous list of stock as well. So you might find that if you go on other sites, they kind of have like some of the, maybe like the Ryzen CPUs or like some of the cases. But if you really want the best possible selection, you need to go to a PC retailer. And Overclockers UK, we've been working with them for years. They're fantastic. They also offer next day delivery as well, even if you order relatively late into the day or afternoon, which is really useful if you're putting something together and you realize you're missing like a couple of fans or you've just made a mistake on your order. Really, really useful. And you often get some Haribo as well in the box, which is a nice little bonus. A massive thank you to Overclockers UK for sponsoring this video. Everything that you find here is listed down below with Overclockers UK links, as well as other global stores as well. We're aware not everyone lives in the UK. But let's now enter the realm of PC gaming and get this thing started. It's incredibly exciting, and I really hope that you can follow along at home. Now, the first thing that you're going to need to do is just make sure, obviously, you grab everything that you need, including all of the parts, but then also your tools. And the good news is very straightforward. Most builds, you probably need 2 screwdrivers. Both are Phillips crossheads. One is slightly smaller than the other. This is going to be used for things like plugging and screwing your motherboard in, like installing fans, whilst this one is just going to be used for putting your storage in, your tiny little SSD. Now, some rigs, most of them not, but some rigs, sometimes you need some pliers if you've got a screw that needs kind of like, well, say screw, it's a standoff, but we'll walk you through what a standoff is a little bit later. Sometimes they need a little bit of a tighten, or sometimes you need to move them around. Pliers are quite useful. As I say, most of the time you won't need these, but these are pretty much the only 3 tools you need. A lot of people are also worried about static, and obviously it's a fantastic idea if you want to have like an anti-static wristband that's kind of attached to the chassis because it can ground you. I'm not specifically going to recommend for or against that. All I'm going to do is say that I've built probably like 100 PCs in this very room, and I've never done it, and as far as I know, I've never had an issue. That doesn't mean you won't. If you want to feel more comfortable by using some anti-static protection, that's fantastic, but all I'm saying is I don't, and I haven't had an issue. But as I say, it's a lot of expensive gear, so I understand if you want to. My first rig, I did. Choosing parts. I've done a full video on this that goes through everything in much greater detail, and if you haven't watched that, I highly recommend that you do, because choosing your PC parts is incredibly important, because it means you're getting great value for money and that everything will be properly compatible. You can find that video in the top right corner of your screen. Honestly, really, really good. Hopefully by the end of it, you'll be an expert on everything PC parts. But a quick recap, if you haven't, or if you need a recap, essentially it's kind of 8 different PC parts that you need for a full completed rig. You can obviously go for more than this, and we are doing it here today, but typically you need 8 things to make sure that your gaming PC works. The first one is a case. Obviously this has got everything and it's going to go inside it. The key thing really you need to worry about here, or think about I suppose, is airflow. If you have a really closed off case, then you might find that it's a lot harder to get your temperatures nice and low because it's harder for air to enter or exit the case. But then the other thing really is just the size. If you want to have it on your desk, obviously be aware that large dual chamber cases take up a lot of space, but then also size for the motherboard. You can't go for a tiny little case and then put a full-size motherboard in it, but likewise you can't, well you can, but it would look a little bit silly if you went for a massive case and put a small motherboard inside it. Now we have different sizes, and these will be listed for your case. And the different sizes are ATX, Micro ATX, or Mini ITX. This is a full-size ATX motherboard. That's going to be the best bet for most people because it's got loads of sockets on it, loads of ports, and most cases are ATX these days. But typically, if you want to step down and go for something smaller, most people probably go for ITX and build like a really small rig. But especially if you're building a budget-friendly system, you can get MATX, Micro ATX, get a slightly smaller case, and then you can save a bit of money here as well. The downside though is that you don't always get the full 4 RAM slots, which is useful for upgrading, but then just because it's a smaller motherboard, there's usually less on it, which doesn't necessarily matter to most people, but if you want to put loads of different PCIe devices and just have the flexibility of maybe like loads of SSDs and things, you are limited a bit more by physical space. I will add, by the way, that obviously we are going to spend the next few minutes going through all of the parts. If you think you already know this and just want to skip ahead to the process, use the timestamps on the video that can take you to the exact bit that you need, or just skip ahead to the bit where we actually build it. But what I was going to say is that this motherboard is an AMD motherboard. You get AMD and Intel, and the best way of knowing compatibility really is to have a look at the socket. So this is an AM5 compatible motherboard, which means the processors that's going to go inside this are AM5. Now, to doubly check that your processor is compatible, I'd always choose the processor first, then look at the motherboards and just go on the manufacturer's website and it will say supported CPUs. And then assuming you've got the latest BIOS update, this CPU will be compatible with the motherboard. The reason I add that last bit is because here we're using a B650E motherboard because this is around about £100 cheaper than the newer B850 equivalent. But the only downside really, other than losing USB 4 and having slightly slower Wi-Fi really on this particular board, is that you will need to do a BIOS flash, a BIOS update in order to actually get this to work. I know this is starting to sound a little bit complicated, but genuinely I think that's probably the most complicated thing about the whole build. So you can relax, everything else is much simpler. Obviously, to pair with this, you are going to need a CPU, and as I say, I would pick this first. The one we're using here is pretty much, in a good way, the most middle-of-the-road, high-end gaming CPU you can get. That's really easy to recommend for basically any system. This is a Ryzen 7 9700X. Obviously, this is from AMD. Most builds at the time of filming that I do are AMD, just because the Ryzen CPUs at the moment are kind of just geared towards gaming and give you better value. But having said that, there certainly are reasons to go for Intel, especially if you go for like a 14th gen chip, or if you're watching this in the future, maybe Intel Core Ultra 2 has got like amazing gaming performance and great value as well. But it doesn't matter too much which way you go as long as you know what you're buying into. I'd always recommend having a look at the benchmarks and things of different video games to ensure that you're getting the right chip for you. But obviously the core count of the CPU is going to be different depending on the one that you go for. So the more money you spend, quite often the more cores you get, but then you can buy like gaming CPUs like the 7900 or 7800 I should say, and the 9800 X3D. These are the best for gaming as long as your graphics card is really good as well. Again, there's no point spending like £500 on a CPU and then £300 on a graphics card, because you'd be much better off doing it the other way around. But typically you need about 8 cores. You could get away with 6 for gaming, especially on a budget-friendly system. And at the time of filming, any more than that doesn't make masses of difference. But if you're watching this in 3 years' time, it might be a different story. You'll probably notice that the box for the CPU though is very, very small. There's no cooler inside this particular one. Budget-friendly chips usually come with something very small that you can use. It's called a stock cooler. It's fine for like getting you by, but if you want something that's much quieter and unlocks the full performance of a lot of the chips, you need something third party. Now, this is very overkill. Remember when I said I was going to make some mistakes, if you like, throughout this video? Potentially, it's to go for something like this. This is a massive 360 liquid cooler. It's going to look awesome. It's going to fill up our case. It's going to give you great thermal performance and low noise for your CPU. But if you're trying to save as much money as possible and really kind of like pump up the FPS, then instead of going for a liquid cooler, I'd usually recommend that most people go for, he says trying not to drop stuff, one of these. This is Arctic Freezer 36 ARGB. It's my personal favorite cooler because in terms of value for money, this is often around about like 30, 35 pounds or dollars, even with the ones with the RGB. And it's actually suitable for most gaming CPUs. It's going to be nice and quiet, going to run relatively cool as well, and it's kind of all you need. So ask yourself, does it really make sense to be spending like an extra £100 or $100 plus on something like this when that could go towards a better graphics card and I'll get a more noticeable improvement in games? There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but I'd probably say most people would be better off with this. But we're going to install both throughout this video again, just to show you the differences and, well, how to install both. Obviously, you're also going to need to grab yourself some storage or an SSD. Now, if you already have like existing drives, so maybe like an old school SATA SSD or like a hard drive from yesteryear, then obviously you can bring that across if you want. But the benefits with this is it's so much faster. In fact, a lot of games these days won't actually work on a hard drive at all because you need a decent read-write speed just to have all the assets and things load in properly. But then because there's no moving parts, you won't have any like horrible vibrations or anything in your system. The downside is obviously they're a fair bit more expensive, but in this day and age, no one really installs Windows on a hard drive. I mean, you might have done like 10 years or so ago. Just grab yourself an SSD. They're much cheaper these days as well. This is a relatively speaking quite a high-end one. This is a Samsung 990 Pro, but typically you can get something decent for around about £60 or dollars or so. So that can save you about £30, but these are often on sale and are pretty easy to recommend, to be honest. Other thing to note as well is obviously the capacity of the drive. It's very easy to add more at a later date, so I would always kind of go for a lower capacity drive and spend money on like other bits of your PC to again just get you the best possible performance. But particularly if you have like really slow internet, that's when having like a 2 or 4 terabyte SSD might come in handy, so you don't need to keep like deleting games and reinstalling them. But a terabyte or 2 is going to be the best bet for most people. Then we also need our RAM, random access memory. It's very easy for gaming PCs these days. Typically everyone wants to go for 32 gigabytes. You want to get a speed of 6,000 megahertz, and you want to find one that says CL30 on it. Now that is the latency, and obviously that is the speed. The faster the memory, in theory, the better the CPU performance can be, but there's a sweet spot really where you start to spend more money and you don't really gain any extra performance. That's kind of over 6,000 megahertz, and because most people are buying 6,000 megahertz memory, the pricing on this is usually pretty good. I think at the time of filming this one was £110. You can get away with 16 gig, but it should be advised that pretty much all PCs these days are DDR5. So if you have older memory that says DDR4 in it, you can't carry this across. You can't put it in this system and upgrade it. Sadly, it's not going to work. So you will have to buy some new DDR5 RAM. Oh, and then I can't believe we left this long. The graphics card, obviously the most exciting bit of any gaming PC, and always the thing that you should pump as much money into as possible. I mean, the best way for choosing PC parts is to pick a graphics card first, then find a CPU that will kind of pair with it. You want to make sure that the frame rates of the two can line up really. So again, you're not spending far too much money on one and then not enough on the other. But with the graphics card, you do also need to be aware that obviously you can buy an AMD or an NVIDIA GPU. They typically vary in the sense that NVIDIA has better software, but they often charge a price premium. And in the case of the RTX 5070, you don't actually get as much VRAM on that. You get a 12 gigabyte VRAM buffer, which again probably sounds a little bit confusing. The cheat sheet way of knowing is that an 8 gigabyte card should be okay for 1080p, 12 gig should be fine for 1440 or Quad HD gaming, and then 16 gig for 4K. However, that's not like an absolute, and the problem is that a lot of graphics cards these days are coming with 8 gigabytes of VRAM, so things like the 5050 or the 5060 for instance, but then that already means you're having to turn down settings today when you bought the graphics card because you've got enough power to run the games, let's say, at the frame rate and the settings that you want, but you don't have enough memory or VRAM on the card itself. And obviously this is only going to get worse over time. So we don't actually recommend most people go for an 8 gigabyte card unless you really are on a budget, or maybe you're getting something used, for instance. That's not to say you absolutely categorically should not do it, but it's definitely worth spending a little bit more to buy like a 16 gigabyte graphics card. So this one is a 5060 Ti. It comes in 8 and 16. We would always recommend people get the 16 because ultimately this is a card that's going to last a lot longer. Remember when I said I was going to give you a quick overview of all these components? Well, I've been a lot more thorough than I thought I was going to be. Hopefully it's useful, but definitely with the GPU, if you don't watch anything else, watch this video up here that explains how to buy a graphics card, because there's so much more to think about and it's the most important thing in your gaming PC. But last, but certainly not least, we have this, the power supply. And I'll be honest, it's pretty boring, but it is really important. This essentially gets your mains electricity and then converts it to the voltages that all of the different components needs. Now, the easiest way to buy this is actually just to go on your graphics card specification sheet online, and this will give you a minimum PSU requirement. And this will tell you what 9 out of 10, probably more, people should be buying essentially. So if this says you need a 650 watt power supply, you can get a 650 and everything should work, because this is like going to assume that you've got like a really powerful CPU. So it's giving you a little bit of headroom. So you can get away with something smaller, but actually for most people, I recommend doing the opposite and to go for something a little bit over spec. So if it says 650, maybe get a 750. If it says 750, get an 850. And the reason for this is just because chances are you're probably going to upgrade your system at a later date to a new graphics card, and usually you end up spending a little bit more on that component, and if you have to buy a new power supply again just to accommodate it, it's pretty frustrating. And there's not often that much difference, maybe like $30–40 between a 750 and an 850, for example. But it is a genuine mistake that a lot of people make, is that they go out and buy like a really high-end power supply that they don't need, and again then they have to maybe step down to a cheaper CPU or a cheaper GPU to compensate. So buy the right power supply, but if you've got a little bit extra budget, then yes, step it up by 100 watts would be my advice. Oh, and then ladies and gentlemen, I think we are now ready to actually get started. You've probably noticed though how I haven't mentioned these, which are some extra fans, because these obviously are not vital to your gaming PC. Most cases will actually come with some as standard. This is actually my favorite case. This is the NV5 V2, and as you can see, it doesn't come with any, so we are going to add some. But the biggest mistake that a lot of people make with their gaming PC is, to be honest, it's buying things like this. Now, to be clear, this is a good product. I like these, they're very good fans, but these fans cost more than the case for a pack of 3 fans. I know they're gonna look great, I know they're easily controllable, and we'll be using them today, but if you're on a budget or you're really just trying to maximize FPS, I would advise going for some cheaper fans and just turning them down. It might not look quite so pretty, but again, you're going to be looking at your monitor anyway and getting a higher frame rate. So the 2 packs of fans that we have here today cost around about £220. So it's very easy to take a lot of money off this rig just by going for cheaper fans, or not even necessarily populating all of them. I mean, you could see what thermals you're going to get. I probably wouldn't recommend it, but obviously you will have a CPU cooler in here that will be moving air around, so you might find that you don't actually need anything, but you can get fans quite cheap for like $10–15 each, and you just get a couple and you know, you'd be fine. Other reason as well that I wanted to use these is just to show you that they come in different flavors. So these are LX120's RGB, and then this one you notice has that R in the name. Now that stands for a reverse blade. If you're going for high-end fans that have got like a pretty side and an ugly side, then because obviously it's only going to be on one side of the fan, sometimes you need to buy R or reverse blade just so they look right in your rig. So for example, here we're going to use this bit, this side, as an intake, and for most fans that would mean you'd see the back of the fan. So that's why you want the reverse blades. So the reverse side is the pretty bit. Got that? I mean, if you're not building a gaming PC without reverse blade fans, oh, are you even a real gamer? That's a trick question. The answer is yes. Oh, but now, ladies and gentlemen, comes the bit where the party really gets started. The time to build has begun. And there's not necessarily a right or wrong order or way to actually put everything together, but there's definitely quite a few things you can do just to make your life easier, to speed it up, and just to save you a mess and a headache. The first one really is to make sure you're building in an area with lots of light. There's some tiny little labels you're going to have to look at throughout this, and especially if it's inside the black case, if you're in a dark, dingy space, it's going to make it a lot more difficult. You'd be like flying around with a torch, not ideal. The other thing is just to make sure the space that you're building on is large. We're going to be opening quite a lot of boxes, some of them all at the same time. So you don't want to kind of end up with like some cables in the wrong box or screws going back to the wrong place. It can get confusing. It's a nice big area, and as you open a box, once you're done with it, do put it away neatly. I know I'm a bit guilty of not always doing that, but practice what I preach, not necessarily what I do. But I'm going to be on best behavior in this video, so don't worry about it. The other thing, and I think a lot of people would be kind of making a beeline towards their case, and this would be the first thing that they would be getting ready, but we don't actually need to touch this at all until we've got our motherboard ready, because it's a lot easier to start on top of the box, because we can access everything, we can see everything. And then the other thing as well is, if you can build with someone else there, obviously ideally someone that's done it before, but even 2 people that haven't done it, it's going to be a lot easier because you're both going to be able to see things that the other person hasn't seen. You can double check the connections, and if someone does something wrong, there's obviously a higher chance that someone will notice and go, oh no, you've put that in the wrong place. We'll walk you through some of the easy mistakes, as I say, throughout this video, including the ones that I did for my first ever gaming PC. You'll notice that this is in quite a loud bag. This is an anti-static bag, and again, I've not really had any issues with damaged components, but if you get something out of an anti-static bag and you ever need to put it like back away, put it back in the bag, don't leave it on the bag, because that's not going to do anything. But this is what your motherboard looks like, and again, will come in different sizes. This is the full-size ATX. A micro ATX kind of cuts off here, so it's like 2/3 of a board, whereas ITX would literally just be this here. So again, most people want a full-size board, full-size case. Certainly for your first build, it makes everything a lot easier. But the main areas you do need to be aware of, you can see you are able to handle it. Don't obviously throw it around, but don't be too scared to kind of like pick it up and look at bits and bobs. As long as you don't drop it, you should be fine. This is the really delicate area underneath this cover. This is where your CPU is going to go. It will have some pins. If you touch any of these pins, or dare I say, accidentally drop something on the pins, there's a high chance your motherboard can break. This is by far the most delicate bit of the whole build. This is where our RAM is going to go. You'll see we have 4 slots on this, but again, smaller motherboards sometimes have 2, which is a bit annoying if you want to upgrade it at a later date. While you're here, I would actually recommend that you open up slots 2 and 4. These are the ones that we're going to use. It would be very tempting to kind of put them directly next to the CPU. You'd actually be getting half the speed if you do that. So open them up now. You want 2 and 4. This is where your graphics card is going to go in this slot here. This is called a PCIe slot. They have different speeds. Currently we're on PCI generation 5. Now you'll probably not notice this, but this is actually a heatsink for the SSD. This is where our drive is going to sit. We're going to open this up and it can go under there. But then we also have a few other bays here as well for extra drives if we want to upgrade it in the future. But generally speaking, you always want to use this top slot as it should be the fastest speed available. Editor Cole shall now cut to the lovely B-roll that we took earlier of the I/O, or the input output, and this shows all of the ports that we have on this particular motherboard. And you may notice as well that we have Wi-Fi. Remember I said earlier, newer motherboards with more bandwidth typically have a better Wi-Fi standard, but this only really matters if you've got a router that's the same standard, or it's not going to necessarily be any faster. But a lot of cheaper motherboards don't have Wi-Fi at all. So I would highly recommend that if you are going to use Wi-Fi, that you get a motherboard that's a little bit more expensive that has it from the off, because otherwise you have to buy an add-in card, and by the time you've done that, it might even end up more expensive than just buying a decent motherboard in the first place. Depending on what and how you're going to use your motherboards, you might also need some of the other bits inside the box. This is the Wi-Fi antenna. This is going to connect to these little gold connections here. But underneath this, you'll probably find that you're going to have a manual. And if you've ever read a manual in your life, I mean, we're only talking like 5-6 pages, it's probably this, because this is going to walk you through where to plug everything in, the do's and the don'ts, and if you do ever have a problem, if you have like an error, well, maybe it's a LED, maybe it's like a number on the motherboard, depending on what you buy. This should tell you how to fix the problem. So I don't often need to look at this, but even these days, sometimes if I get a weird bug or error, it's always worth checking in your motherboard. Again, everything's very small as well. All the text is small on the motherboard. It should be easier to read on this. That aside though, you'll also find you get some like welcome stuff that obviously you really don't need. These are SATA cables. These are going to be used if you have like an older SSD or like a hard drive or something. Chances are you've probably already got these though if you're moving them from an old rig, but if you buy a hard drive, you will need one of these plugged in for data. We've got some cable ties, but useful to get everything tidy. Got an SSD screw there, a couple of M.2 pads if you're using like the lower down slots and things. Thermal pad. Most of these things you're not going to need. Because I mean, case in point, I didn't actually know what was in this box, and I've been using this motherboard for about 3 years. But let's close this up, grab our motherboard, and then properly get our party started. And as I say, it's going to be a little bit nerve-wracking, but hopefully you will have fun. And if at any point you get stressed, I've said this a million times, and it always sounds like I'm like making some British joke, I'm dead serious. Take a time out, just go and sit somewhere for like 15 minutes with like a cup of tea or a cup of coffee if you really want to do that, just because it should calm you down, because it's very stressful, and if something isn't plugging into the bit that you think it is, or maybe like you're getting some weird boot errors or something if your PC's not working, sometimes it's just nice to have a clear head. Just take a time out. I promise every single time I get in that situation and I do it, I'm so thankful that I have. But hopefully you shouldn't need to do that, because it is actually pretty straightforward. So the first thing that we're going to do is actually install our CPU. So remember, this is our cover. We don't need to take this off. This will automatically remove when we put our chip inside. So what we can do is grab our Ryzen 7, and then with what I'd describe as a normal amount of force, just gently open this up, leave it to one side for a second, and then we're going to have to lift this little cover, or this retention arm, like so. And then we're going to actually lift up the flap here. And this is where obviously all of the pins are now exposed. Please don't drop anything in there. Please don't touch it. It would be so incredibly sad, because you'd be saying bye-bye to your rig, and you do not want to do that. But the good news is this is pretty much the only ultra sensitive bit of the whole process. You can pick up your processor and you can have a look at it. I wouldn't advise touching it any more than you need to, but you see, like, you can, and it's not going to spontaneously combust, but definitely try to be a little bit more careful of the back side of it, because you don't want oils and things to go on here. But again, it's not the absolute end of the world if it does, but this is by far the most sensitive bit. Be very careful, but just drop this into place. So you can see here, it's almost in, but that's okay. I just gave it a slight nudge, and then it will kind of clip itself into position. To get this secure though, obviously we need to push this flap downwards, kind of catch it a little bit with this lever, and then you'll notice this starts to ping off. That is according to plan, but you just park this back, make sure that this does then remove, and make sure that this is properly inside. Carl can show the clip now of the only time I haven't managed to do this properly. You'll lift up your motherboard and this will happen. True story, it's because I've just brushed. True story, it's because I've just brushed. How did that happen? Which I'll be honest, wasn't very fun. And it won't be very fun if it's your CPU, so get it secure. With that complete then, as I say, just tidy as you go, but I'm really pleased to say that the most sensitive bit has been undertaken, so congratulations, give yourself a pat on the back. But now we can press on to some easier stuff. So we're gonna move on to the RAM, or the random access memory, and you're gonna get two different sticks, two different DIMMs. You can use just one, but you'll be getting half the speed. But unless you're buying a really high-end like Threadripper system, if you buy 4, it's not gonna increase the speed, it will just increase the capacity. Now, remember, as I say, this is DDR5, this is a DDR5 motherboard. Make sure that they match or it's physically not going to fit and you'd be very sad. But it's very straightforward in these slots that we've already opened up, so 2 and 4. Just make sure that this lines up with this little notch here. DDR5, it's almost in the middle, which is a bit annoying, so you might have to give it a little wiggle until you actually get it in place. And then obviously pick up the second stick. This one should be easier because you know which way it actually goes in. It's very satisfying actually plugging in RAM. You get that proper thud. But the important bit is to make sure that these have actually gone back all of the way. Sometimes they'll be on the top and the bottom. This one just has them on the top. So a dead giveaway, if it's not inserted properly, it might look something like that, look, which you might not notice, but you do need to give it a proper push until that clicks in all of the way. It's subtle, but if it's not pushed in all of the way, then your PC might not boot and you might be really confused. And it's also sometimes confusing because whilst it should say RAM error, sometimes it doesn't actually say RAM error. It might say like CPU or something. You'd be like, why is my CPU not working? But it's actually just the RAM, but that's rare. As I say, as long as you've plugged everything in properly, you should be fine. Then we can press on to our SSD. And again, this one's got high end. You can go for a cheaper one that will give you very similar, I was going to say very similar performance. I mean, it is similar enough anyway, but in terms of what you're actually going to notice when you're using your PC and loading games, yes, definitely very similar. But we can just open this one up, look, and you will notice that this thing is absolutely tiny. It always blows my mind actually just how small these are. I mean, it's kind of like the size of your index finger, which is pretty cool. But this is the point where you're going to need to grab that smaller size screwdriver, and we're just going to open this up, look, just by unscrewing these 2 screws. This should then remove, and don't look at this, guys. This is the thermal pad. You remember we had a spare one in the box? This is why, because I've used this board like 10, 11, 12 times, and this is getting more and more mangled. But yours will look a lot nicer than this and will have a little peel. You just take this off, and then this thermal pad just helps the heat go from the SSD into the heatsink, and then obviously the fans in your system will then help to kind of blow that heat away. But make sure you take that peel off just so you're actually getting it to do something. Then you can pick up your SSD. Some of them will be double-sided. This is more down to the capacity. This is 1 terabyte, so it's not. But it's worth noting that if you're having a like really high capacity SSD, it may well be worth going for one that actually has a heatsink built into it, because then you're covering both sides of the SSD. But some high-end motherboards, especially newer ones, do have double-sided heatsinks these days. But this literally just pushes down. Just need to move this catch, look, and then move that so that it's secured into position. And then we can pick this up again and then just gently lay this over those holes and then screw that back into position. And then once you've done that, the good news is that your motherboard is actually pretty much ready to go in your chassis, depending on whether you're using an air cooler or using all-in-one liquid. But before we do that, I think it's going to be a lot more useful to kind of walk you through the motherboard and what you're looking at really, and what you're going to need to connect things to, so you understand it. And the best way of doing this obviously would be to look in your motherboard manual. If there's any name or anything there that you don't kind of know if you need it or what it does, that should tell you. But for a little bit of quick insight, essentially, you'll notice obviously there's a lot of stuff here. So we've talked about the CPU socket, the RAM, the M.2, and then these PCIe expansion slots. So this one is where your graphics card's going to go. But if you've got like a Wi-Fi card or like a capture card for gaming or something like that, then it will connect to one of these ones here. They're different sizes which have different speeds. But there's loads of these tiny little pins dotted throughout that you kind of do need to use. So the most important one, well, most important 2 I'd say, are these 2 up here. These are for your CPU fans. So when you connect your cooler, you're going to connect to these. If something's not connected, your PC won't usually boot into Windows. It will give you an error because it doesn't want to cook itself. So this will send power to your fan, and then the fan will spin up. And the clever thing about it is that it can kind of read the CPU temperature and adjust the speed accordingly, because you don't want your fans to be running 100% all of the time. It's going to be really annoying. It's like the compressor in your fridge, right? If your fridge is making that really loud noise all of the time, it'd be pretty annoying, but it only does that every now and then when it needs to. Now, the other thing is down the bottom here, and this is where we're going to plug in our power switch to the case. So this is obviously what makes this button turn your PC on. And if you don't connect this up, the button's quite literally not going to do anything. All it is a little gate essentially. So when you press it down, the signal can go from one pin to the other. So if you're ever testing whether the button on your case works or not, you can just grab a little screwdriver, and then where are they? These two here. You can just press these together, and then in theory your PC should turn on. That's essentially what the button does. But you'll notice that there's quite a few different things here as well. Typically you won't be using like the right of this, you just use these four here on the left. So you've got your power switch, power LEDs, hard drive LEDs, and then your reset switch. One of the most common things, and the first thing that I did in my first ever gaming PC, don't be ashamed if this happens to you, is that I plugged my power switch into the power LEDs. So sure enough, when I turned on the PC, nothing happened. That's when I got really upset. That's when I needed to go and take a time out. I was like, oh, why didn't I just buy a Dell or an Alienware? But it was actually a very easy thing to remedy. So yes, don't get your power switch confused with your power LEDs, but all of the text here you see is very small, which is why I recommend the motherboard manual. But then most rigs, you're also going to be plugging in more fans. They're called chassis fan. We also have these RGB headers as well. So you've got a 4-pin, which is kind of old school fans or old school coolers, but most of them are these 3-pin addressables. So we've got one here and then 2 more down the bottom, but this is going to vary depending on the motherboard. So if you buy a lower end motherboard, it might have less of these or potentially none. It's all down to the board, so obviously check before you buy anything. You also have USB. These are USB 2.0, so they're slow but fine for most fan controllers, or if you're using like a fancy cooler and your motherboard can control it, then they're going to plug in down here. We've got much faster USB, and this is usually for the front panel of your chassis. You've got USB-C. Annoyingly, this actually isn't a USB-C port, which would be better, but that turns into USB-C. And then this is the USB 3, so that blue one on the front of your chassis will plug in down here. And then this one here that's called AAFP. I guess that stands for Analog Audio Front Panel, but most motherboards it will say HD audio. This is if you're going to plug in an old school pair of headphones or an analog headset into your case. Again, this is what sends that sound signal between the case and the board. You also have some SATA ports. You're getting less and less on new boards as well. So if you're plugging in a hard drive, or again using like an old school SSD, these will plug in down here. But do remember that those need to be powered as well, not just data. You have 2 cables for those, one for the motherboard and then one to actually power it up. Oh, and speaking of power, last things last, we also have our power connections. This is an ATX. This is very big, you can't miss it. This is going to connect to the power supply, and then your CPU also takes power up here at the top left. Now, for most systems, and emphasis on most, you only need to plug in one 8-pin. You'll often find that you have one 8 and then one 4, or one 8, and then another 8 for 2. This is usually only for high-end overclocking or like really high-end CPUs like, I don't know, 14900K or something where it needs more power. I'm not saying here that you should only plug one in, but if you're doing a budget-friendly build and your power supply only has one cable that can go to it, don't worry about it. I can't remember the exact figure, so if I can get Editor Carl to note it down, but I think you can do like 150, 160 watts or something through a single 8-pin, and most CPUs are anywhere between 65 and about 120 really, especially for Ryzen CPUs, which is why I say you should be fine with these. Your PC would still boot, it's just potentially you won't be able to overclock it as far. But it's good practice to plug in both. So that in a nutshell should be everything that you need to know, but now comes the time to actually get our cooling installed. So I'm going to end up with an all-in-one liquid cooler inside this, but as I say, most people, I think you're going to want to go for one of these, which is an air cooler, just to maximize the bang for buck and the amount of FPS you're getting for the money that you'd spend. There's no doubt in my mind, if I was building a personal gaming PC like this for me tomorrow, it would be with this cooler, right? I know all-in-ones look better, especially if you're getting like a pre-build or something. I should say as well, actually, if you do want to grab a PC build, then the sponsor of this video, Overclockers UK, have loads of pre-builds. So if you're watching this and you think, I just don't want to do it, then have a look at Overclockers UK's pre-builds as well, because as I say, you've got loads of options and they'll send it to you. Some of them, I assume, next day, but it depends whether they have to build them. The point I was trying to make is that if you go for a pre-build, then actually all-in-one does make more sense because it's less likely to get damaged in shipping. But then I would guess that's not really your fault anyway, so it shouldn't make too much difference to you. But this is what an air cooler typically looks like, a lot bigger than a stock one. I'll see if I can find one. And I mean, look at that. That is That is tiny. The heat sink on that, so the amount of metal that the heat has to absorb into essentially is tiny, and then you've got this really small fan on top. So look, when you do a side by side, there's no competition really, is there? And what this is designed to do is to dissipate heat and mean you can put more power into your CPU and do so while having less noise essentially. So this is not a very good solution, but it's free and comes with certain CPUs. This for about £35 actually makes your end user experience, which is just a much quieter, nicer and better looking PC, so well worth it. But to actually get this cooler installed, it's worth bearing in mind that every single cooler is going to be slightly different. They often use the same mounting mechanism because you've got these 4 physical screws here. This is actually what we call the default AM5 mount, where some coolers you will literally hook onto these and then it kind of secures down into place. But most coolers don't actually do that, which is a little bit weird, especially bear in mind a lot of AMD's own like stock coolers also don't use this mechanism, so I don't really know why they bother. But you've got these bits of plastic, and don't worry, this is normal, depending on obviously what you're installing. You just want to remove these 4 screws here, like so, and then that should remove. Don't lose these, just in case you change your cooler and you might need it essentially. It's just good practice, just put it in your motherboard box. But just do this with both halves. Then you're going to want to go to your cooler box and pick up the accessories bag that will have a load of screws and some brackets and things, and look a little bit like this, look. But the thing to remember is that typically 1/3 of what's in there is what you need, because you have different mounting solutions for different size sockets. So the mounting solution for AMD is different to Intel, and if you buy like a Threadripper CPU or you buy like a really high-end X299 CPU from yesteryear, that has different physical sizes, which is why you need different physical mounts in order to actually get your cooler to fit. But I think everything here actually I've pre-sorted to just the AMD stuff. So you've got these little brackets here. The best way of working it out if you're unsure is just to kind of line them up. If they fit over the holes, you're almost certainly onto a winner, look. But once again, whilst this is absolutely going to vary depending on the cooler that you get, with this particular one, we just want to put these little spacers on top, and they look different depending on the brands, but most cooling solutions you have to do something similar. Then you'll add some brackets, and again, varies depending on the brand, but most brands install this way. So let's get this screwed down with this little nubbin look facing upwards, because the cooler is going to then screw into that and then get safe and secure. If you're wondering how tight you should be screwing things like this, by the way, it sounds obvious, but it's like the right amount of tightness. So obviously you screw down to get a bit of resistance, then you can go slightly more and then you stop. You don't want to be hammering down until there's absolutely nothing more that you can do. It's not necessarily going to break everything, but it would almost certainly break something if you do that. So if in doubt, keep it, I don't want to say loose, but just don't go ham on it. But let's repeat with the other side. And then comes the really fun bit that a lot of people get a bit nervous about, but you really don't need to be. It's thermal compounds. You get 2 typical ways of installing this, if you like. So some coolers, probably like the Corsair one, has it pre-applied. This is easier because you don't need to do anything. You just make sure that you don't kind of accidentally remove it when you're installing it. But you just drop it down into place. It'll be on the underside of your cooler, and then you can screw it in, and then you know you've got the right quantity, the right spread, all of this stuff. But I prefer it like this, where they give you a little tube and you have to add this yourself, because it just means that you've got multiple installations. So if you ever want to take your cooler off and put a new CPU in, you don't have to buy new thermal compound. But you can see this is the last actually of this stuff that I have in the tube. That's probably the right amount. We say a small pea-sized amount, but as long as you've got enough, you'll be fine. Like, don't go putting like crazy amounts on, because it's not really going to make any difference. But if you forget the thermal compound, you'd certainly know about it. But we're just going to grab this, look, and then we're going to gently lay that over those screws. Then we're going to screw to about 25% on one side, 50 on the other, and then kind of just alternate until it is safe and secure. You'll find that there's a fair bit of resistance. This one kind of just stops rather than kind of like letting you do a little bit more at a time. But then you can see we have our heatsink actually attached, and then the heat from the CPU obviously will go up into the cooler. But in order for that to actually be expelled somewhere, obviously we need some fans. So these are the ones that you get as standard. Very important, make sure that they're blowing the right way, because obviously a fan will go like that. So if you plug it in like this, especially if you've got 2 fans and you have them blowing in towards each other, that's not going to be very good for your thermals, is it? So if you ever have significant problems and you can't work out what it is, check the orientation of your fans. But generally speaking, if you can see the label, it means it's blowing away from you, and you want to make sure all of your cables are actually at the bottom, so they are nice and neat and out of the way. And on this cooler, it's really easy. So they literally just push on like that. And then our cooler is installed. All we need to do is find these little cables here. These are our addressable RGB and our fan speed. So we just need to find our CPU headers that you should be seeing from this lovely B-roll, and then just carefully plugging this in, look, to this grey one. On some motherboards, to be fair, the grey is for like an all-in-one pump, which is designed to be on all of the time, so you know that your pump is running at the max speed essentially. But you can customize them in software, but the main thing is that they are actually plugged in. So that's our fan, and then you can see these are daisy chained as well, so the two fans are already connected together. But we've got 3 pins, so you just want to make sure that obviously the single pin is over the single pin. These are annoyingly fiddly, but that should just go over like that. And then that would be your CPU cooler installed if you were going for an air cooler. And then this would obviously just drop into the PC and we can resume. But as I say, we're going for an all-in-one today, so let's get on with that. Which means I have to now take this off, but I can show you a quick trick actually while we're here, which is if you're unsure whether your CPU is making good contact with the cooler, then you can actually install it, take it off, and then have a look at this spread, because as long as the thermal compound is covering most of the CPU, you know you've installed it properly. If you've got like some really obvious gaps, then it might be you haven't used enough paste, or that there's not enough contact essentially between the cooler and the CPU. But it's worth remembering that when you turn it on and you get a bit of heat, this is going to help to just spread it just that little bit more. So I wouldn't be worried about the fact that you're missing a little bit there, for instance, but in an ideal world, I probably would have added a little bit more if I got a bigger tube. So with that out of the way, we can then press on to our cooler. And it's worth remembering that we're not actually going to install this yet. We want to get our motherboard inside the case, but it's definitely worth grabbing the box now just to check how it mounts, because if we need to say put these back on, or if they were off and you need to take them off and put some third-party mount, again, it's a lot easier to do this whilst the motherboard is here and we can clearly see and access everything before we put it in our case. But having said that, if you forget, it's not the end of the world. But this one is actually pretty easy to set up, if I can remember correctly, because a lot of modern ones, you'll find that the fans are pre-installed to the radiator, and the mounting on this as well, it just screws directly into the socket, I've remembered now, which is very, very neat. But a lot of them you all have to like put some third-party plate or something on the motherboard like we did with the air cooler. But I realise you're probably brand new to PC gaming, so if you're wondering essentially what this is, how it works, it's a similar principle to a normal like air CPU cooler, whereby the heat goes into the little pump unit that we have here, but there's actually a plate inside here and the water will run through it and then go through these tubes and then will be dumped in this radiator, which obviously has a very large surface area, and then the fans will blow through this and then it will go out, or depending on your orientation, into your chassis, and then that process will then cool the water that will then go back down the tubes, and then obviously it will repeat the process. These are great for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think most people agree they look better if you've not got like a huge mass or something on top of your CPU. It's also better for transportation, as we've said, but also if you're going for like a really high-end system where you've got like a really big beefy graphics card, you've got to remember if you're using an air cooler, quite often the graphics card will spit hot air directly out into the line of your air cooler, which then means that it's harder to actually get that to run coolly. So it either run faster, or potentially you might find that it actually can't keep up with all of this hot air, and then your CPU clock speeds will be reduced because it's just getting too warm. Whereas if you go for an all-in-one, you can just move that heat from here to either the top of the chassis or like the side or the front, depending on the case that you're going for, which can be more optimal and just give you better temperatures throughout. But as I say, it's very expensive, and for most systems, I think an air cooler will be absolutely fine. But when you start talking, you know, like 5070 Ti, 5080, 5090, that sort of stuff, yes, this really does start to kind of make a lot more sense. But as I say, this one is incredibly easy to install. You just have these two little AMD brackets, look. So you find your pump unit, just slide these on top till they meet, and then you've got these 4 screw holes, look, that will line up with those on the board and will just go straight in. Happy days. No third-party mount required. So the good news with that then is that we can just gently park that to one side for a second, and now we're ready to put this inside our case. Very exciting stuff. And we haven't talked about the case really at all, other than the size and form factor, but this is my favorite case on the market. As I say, this is the Phanteks NV5 V2. The reason I really like this one is because it's very well priced. It's roughly £100, depending on when and where you're buying it from. Comes in a few different colors, and it's just very well made. So by that, it's kind of like thickness of the metals and the glass, and obviously the fact that it's just really nicely designed inside. So you will have to add some fans. That's the main downside with this. As I say, you can absolutely do it on the cheap. You can buy some like ID cooling fans or something, dot them throughout. As long as they're turned down, you'll be absolutely fine. But it's just really easy to build inside this, and you've got this cool little RGB strip down the bottom here as well. It just looks neat. My personal rig, you can find this in the top right corner of your screen, is in this, but white. I love that build. I'm still using it today. It's amazing. But what you will need to do is take these side panels off, so both the front and the back, so you can access everything. And this is the point where you might start to think, ooh, maybe I've gone a little bit too far. What have I got myself in for? But I promise it is actually very straightforward. These cables, all they're going to do is connect to the motherboard essentially, just so that the case can talk to it. It's really straightforward. So we've got a few different cables, and I've filmed some B-roll for this, so it should be nice and clear for you. We've got our USBs. So we've got a USB 3. This says USB 3.1 on it. We have a USB 3, which is that blue one. We have our HD audio here. So remember, on this motherboard, it's going to AAFP, analog audio front panel. We've also got our power switch, and actually on most cases, this will probably say front panel. This combines like the power switch, the reset button, and any of those LEDs all in one container. Some cases, there'll still be those tiny little individual ones that are really annoying, but actually a lot of decent cases these days will come as a single block, and then this just plugs in down the bottom as discussed earlier. And then is there anything else here? Yes, depending on the case you have, you might have one of these, which is a SATA power connection. So this is for all of the RGB on this computer to work essentially, because it's going to take a decent amount of power. But you might also have some USB 2s. USB 2 is what the cooler is going to use, and this will connect down the bottom. But again, if you've got like a smart case that has a hub on it, something like that, you might find that needs to connect. And then somewhere on this, you should, yeah, also have one of these, which is an RGB connection. So this is a 3-pin, so this can daisy chain off of some other RGB fans or RGB strips or something that you put in your case. But because this is Fantex, it also has a Fantex connection as well, which uses digital RGB. They're basically the same, they've just got a slightly different pin layout. But we don't actually need to worry about those cables for now. Instead, we can just tuck them out of the way and then just gently lay the case down flat like so. And we're going to pick our motherboard up and put it in here, but it's worth bearing in mind a couple of things. Firstly, you have what's called an I/O shield on most motherboards now that's actually baked into the motherboard. So if I hadn't told you this, you'd never know about it. You know, fine, great. But if you go for a budget-friendly system, you probably get this little metal plate inside the motherboard box. You need to push this here in this little hole, look, as otherwise you're going to have, well, a massive hole in your computer. It's meant to be a bit of shielding, but these days I don't really think it really does much. But hey, like, put it in, otherwise your PC will look a little bit weird. Then you also need to bear in mind these points here. These are the standoffs that we spoke about earlier. So most cases have them pre-installed. So if you're using an ATX case, a large case like we are here, you can see everything that says A actually has a standoff pre-applied. But if we wanted to put a smaller motherboard inside this, this is when we'd need to use our good old friend the pliers, because we need to take these out and then move them to all of the holes that say M. I say all of them, it depends on the motherboard. Some micro ATX motherboards have more holes than others, which is a little bit annoying, but you should know about it if it doesn't line up, because you'll go to push your motherboard in and something won't quite be right. It should fit really nice and flush. But again, you've got ITX as well, so it'll just be these 4 screws if you're doing ITX. This case does actually come with a little removal tool for the standoff, so you wouldn't even need to use the pliers, which is great. But most cases kind of annoyingly don't come with one of those. But the good news is most people should just be able to grab your motherboard and drop it into place, as it will be good to go for you. So we're going to do just that. We will gently line this up. Be careful, but you know, if you have a couple of knocks, it's not the end of the world, it's fine. And this central standoff usually is a little bit taller, so it kind of catches the motherboard, and then you'll see that this now isn't going to move. Obviously, you need to screw it down. You're not going to leave it like this, but that just makes it a lot easier. As I say, it kind of like catches it in place. I'm going to show some B-roll now of the motherboard screws that you're going to need to use. These will come in the box, and they've got these kind of like ring on it, so you know they're the right ones. But this particular case also comes with a case of screws, which is nice, and they should be pre-sorted for you as well. So it's very easy to work out what screws it is that you need. But the motherboard ones are those ring ones, and then as you'd expect, you just need to screw in to all of those open points on the board. Once you've done that, you should notice that your PC is starting to resemble a PC. Things are getting a bit exciting. There's not actually that much more that you need to do. Now, obviously with this particular case, again, remember there's no fans, so we are going to add these Well, I'll say a little bit later, may as well do it now. And it's definitely worth bearing in mind that different fans have different levels of performance, but in terms of physical size, different fans will go in different locations. So your safest bet is to grab 120s. These will fit in almost all places really. But if you go for a larger chassis, then you'll find you can get 140mm fans. 140s are pretty much always better. The reason for this is just because you have a larger mass of fan, so it doesn't need to spin as fast and cause as much noise to actually move as much air, which is great. So you can get better performance and lower noise levels. But most fans are 120 because most cases accept 120s. But we're going to put these 3 reverse blade fans here. I was thinking about adding 2 more, but I think that is a waste of money, so we're just going to use the 3. There you go, I've just saved you 105 quid. Just as easy as that. I told you we were going to make some mistakes, but the good news was we can clear them up as we go along. So these being fancy fans, one of the reasons they're more expensive is because they actually use one of these intelligent hubs, like one of these IQ Link hubs. So unlike traditional fans that have 2 cables, they can get messy, one for RGB, one for fan speed. They all daisy chain together and then over one cable they connect to the hub, and then everything is just going to be much cleaner and tidier. So these are quite high end, but remember that you definitely do not have to buy these specific ones. And again, depending on the case, you'll probably get some fitted as standard, which for most builds will be absolutely fine. But here you can see these are pretty high end actually. They're nice looking fans though, expensive, but nice. But that's what I mean about like reverse blades. This still looks fine to me, but obviously that side looks nicer than this side, which is why you want to make sure you buy the appropriate fan. But with these Corsair ones, you have these little connections that literally just push in, and then you get a little plastic dummy for rigidity as well. Then you should just be able to get these 2 fans, line them up, and then as if by magnet, there you are. They connect together. Very straightforward, pretty tough, pretty sturdy. Let's do the same though with our 3rd fan, and then making sure we've got the orientation that we want, we can just position these in the side of the case, pick up our fan screws, and I will say that these are kind of the fancy screws that come with Corsair fans. They make it a lot easier to screw in, but a normal fan screw looks like this. A little bit longer, a little bit chunkier, and just requires a bit more screwing. But I'll come around this side, look, so you can properly see. All I'm going to do is grab 1 screw and just gently get this in. Remember, because we have this block, we don't need to do a screw for every single one. That's one of the advantages for going for daisy chainable fans, but just get 1 in, just to kind of line it up, and then you can tighten as you go. I mean, with fans, it's a lot harder to over tighten, so I wouldn't worry about it too much, but the more screws you're going to use, the more secure it's in place and the less chance of any vibrations. So this is the way I'll check, just to kind of do that. But there you go, look, as if by magic, and to be fair, they are expensive, but they are so easy to install and obviously very, very clean. You will now have some fans in your case, and do you see how much better and more normal that looks? Not sure it needed to cost £105, but you can do that for probably what, like 30, 35, or you could just get a case, as I say, that comes with them fitted as standard. But that's good to go. So what we need to do now is start thinking about cables. So I'm going to turn this around again just to ensure you can see. And those same cables that we showed you earlier, it's now time to kind of like tuck them into their respective positions. So it'll be slightly different depending on the case of the motherboard, but mostly it's the same. We just want to get this USB and then feed that through to the main chamber somewhere in the middle. The HD audio and the addressable RGB we can tuck through to the bottom. USB-C can come here at the top. The power switch goes right down here at the bottom. And then lastly, our SATA we're going to leave for a little bit because we can't plug that in until our power supply is installed. So when we give this another spin around and then cutting to my favorite thing in the world, the B-roll we took earlier, we can get these plugged in. So the power switch, again, goes at the bottom right-hand side of the motherboard. It's not reversible, so make sure this is plugging in the right way. Then we have our USBs, and again, lovely B-roll look. We've got our USB 3, and then our USB-C. I'm not sure how this is going to look, but this is what we've done so far. We're mixing 2 formats. It's very edgy here on this channel. And then cutting back to our best friend Brol, we have our addressable RGB right down at the bottom, and then our HD audio again all the way at the bottom left. Once you've done it, it should look something like this, but it's good practice just to kind of go over all of those cables again, just give them a slight push just to make sure that they are in properly, and any slack, if you can, kind of push it through just to make it a little bit neater. It's definitely going to help you. I think the next thing that we need to do is to install the cooler though. It says almost knocking screws flying everywhere. So let's return to this, and rather than plugging the pump head into the motherboard first, it's always better really to grab your radiator and install this. Having said that, depending on the case, sometimes it's going to be easier to plug a power supply cable into the top here now, rather than putting the radiator in, because if there's not much clearance here at the top, you'll find that as soon as you put your radiator in, it will actually physically cover up a lot of the ports here. So this could be your CPU, fan, could be your adjustable RGB or any of these powers. In this case, I'm not bothered about it because we've got a lot of space, but on most cases, it's good practice to think about this before you install it. There's just 2 screws here on the back that I need to remove, and then this will obviously come out. Then we can see, I'll show you, look, that we actually have this kind of rail here, and this is where our radiator obviously going to fit, but there's quite a few cases that you have multiple sizes. So this could be for slightly larger fans if you're using 140s, or maybe if you just want to kind of bring it out or push it back a little bit. Cases that give you more flexibility are usually kind of nicer to work with. But here, all we need to do is just kind of put that pump head there and let it sit for a second, and then just gently bring this up. Realize that I haven't got the screws out yet. So let's grab this bag that lovingly says screws on it and open this up. And this is where I say you don't want to get your screws muddled really, so you want to make sure you know what's what. These longer ones you see are if you're going to get a fan and actually kind of go through the fan into the radiator to secure it this way, whereas the ones we want are these really small ones, and you do get washers as well, as depending on the case you might find that the hole up here is a little bit too big. So once again, let's line this up into position, and this is where having 2 people is a lot easier, but you can just put that screw in, grab your screwdriver, potentially wish that you had more friends available, and then just put one in like that. Be sure not to drop this yet, as you'll be putting way too much force on one bit of the radiator and you don't want to bend anything. So instead, screw in the other corner, even if it's just a little bit. Oh, there you go, then your back and shoulders will be very grateful. You can loosen this one up a bit then, and then you can see you can just kind of slide it so you can get it into the exact position that you want. And you should see what I mean here. You can just about kind of still see all of those connections, and there's big holes at the back, so actually managing this should be fine. But again, if it's a shorter case, it would get problematic now. So let's continue with the rest of the screws. Then we can get our top panel and slide that back on. And then to make things as easy as possible, I'm going to lay this down flat once again. And obviously we do need to get our pump head. And at this stage, you'd hopefully still have like a plastic cover and some thermal compounds pre-applied to this exact unit. But again, because I'm reusing this, I need to grab some more. That was, I was going to say purchased separately. ASUS actually sent this one out, but you'll need to grab some separately. And then once again, kind of like a pea-sized amount in the middle. And then it really should just be a case of lining this up, look, with those holes, grabbing your screwdriver, and then 20% force on one bit, the same on the other diagonal. And then it's just a case of tightening up the rest. And I'll tell you what, guys, this really is starting to look like a gaming PC now, isn't it? And especially at the point of installing your graphics card. I can't stress enough again, watch the guide in the top right corner of your screen that goes through how to pick a graphics card and just make sure that you do get the right one for you. But I'd say for most people, it's still expensive, but this is kind of the best mid-range option, really. It's a 5060 Ti, 16 gig. This is going to be great for 1080p, 1440, and actually a fair amount of 4K gaming as long as you're willing to use DLSS. It's going to be okay at ray tracing, but not like amazing, but I think most people are okay with that. And it's going to give you high multiplayer frame rates as well. So pretty much all you need. But if you step up to this to something like a 5070, 5070 Ti, 9070, 9070 XT, then you're just going to have even higher frame rates really in multiplayer games, and it will allow you to turn on a few more ray tracing settings in single player. But as I say, for most people, this is probably all you need. If you want to step down, I would go for a 9060 XT from AMD because its performance isn't that far away from this, but usually is a fair bit cheaper, and it still has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, which is nice. But let's get this out of the box. And this particular version is from Palette, but obviously you've got a whole host of different manufacturers, and I don't really have any favorites, to be honest, because you'll find that actually the cards, they're all using the same GPU, so in theory the performance should be basically the same, but you will find that they will vary depending on the size of the graphics card, so thickness, length, and then obviously the amount of fans and things that they have. And generally speaking, the more fans and the more cooling you've got, the quieter it will be. But especially in this generation, I can't really think of any graphics cards that are really loud. You used to get that all of the time on the cheaper ones, but these days I'd probably just go for the entry-level ones, because in almost all instances they're more than good enough, really. People like ASUS, MSI, Gigabytes, all of them, no one's not guilty of this. They build really over-spec'd cards and kind of give it all that about how great it is. But in terms of frame rates, as I say, they're not really that that different, and they're just making a load of money out of building bigger cooling solutions. So go for a more entry-level one if you can. I've already removed these two slot covers here, but you do just take these screws out and then it will fit in. And in this particular instance, we want 2 and 3 to be removed. You then find this little PCIe finger here, look, and this is going to go in this top slot, but you just want to line this up. Sorry about my head. I just need to make sure it is lined up, and then you can push it into place. You get a nice audible click, and then this will be secured in. If you need to remove it for any reason, you'll find that there is this little catch that's quite hard to activate on this board actually. Oh no, it's not, it's got a quick release. Some motherboards have one of these quick releases, so you push this down and it will release the catch that's holding it into position, and then you can remove it. If you don't do that, then you will break something plastic when you're kind of trying to force it out. So don't force it, just use the quick release mechanism. But obviously once you've got it installed, you will need to now replace those screws just to get this fitted nice and securely. Oh, and then it's starting to get heavy. You'll probably notice this now. But look at this system as it's coming together. Isn't it pretty? I know it looks better with the more expensive cooler, but again, remember to save money for better frame rates for the same cost. You could have gone for their air cooler. I mean, some people don't like the look of these tubes, but hey, each their own really. This is why you want to cable manage as you go as well, because the more stuff you put in it, the harder it is to get everything to look nice. So just a little bit of attention to detail as you proceed throughout the build definitely goes a long way. But it's just a couple more things to do now, mainly being the power supply, but also to get this cooler to actually be plumbed in, because at the moment it's not connected to anything. So where's my box? And here it is. And inside here, remember, most builds won't need all of this gubbins, but I mean, it makes sense for me to walk you through everything because different brands obviously have similar things that work in different ways. So if it was like a Lee & Lee cooler, you'd still have like a junction box and things like this. They're much better when they're magnetic, which a lot of them are, which is quite cool. The Corsair one is very small, but you have these little connections on both sides, and these will connect to the cooler or to the fans, and you can daisy chain them together, which is just one of the ways of removing the amount of cables that you have. You'll see that I've already got this plugged in. This is like a little dummy CPU header. Remember, we didn't plug a CPU fan cable in at the moment because we took that air cooler out. Well, that's what this is. That all connects your motherboard to the cooler. But then also inside the box, we've got the cables that will go to the fans, alongside a USB 2 cable to actually get the cooler connected to the motherboard. And then we also have this little power connection here as well. So this is going to use a PCIe from the power supply to supply power to this hub. So all of the fans, the cooler, everything is powered over a single cable. So one of these cables needs to plug into the cooler. Then this will go to the junction box, but I can just feed this through, look, at the top to get everything neat. And then there's also one on the back of this block of fans. So another cable that we can just feed through into the back chamber, connect the pump head to this little block. Then we need to get this fan cable that's going from the top fans into these fans, which isn't actually that fiddly when you compare it to the alternative, but it feels fiddly at the moment. And I must admit, I am asking myself, why didn't I do this when I installed the fans? Do the same to the port at the bottom, then get this connected to the hub. You also need to connect the USB to the bottom of the hub alongside the power. Then just feed the CPU cable all the way up to the top, and again remembering to cable manage as you go. So I'm going to loosen this and just snap all of the cables into position. Then you just connect that USB to one of the ports at the bottom. Then that CPU cable plugs into that CPU header. And then I'm really pleased to say that we actually are almost done. It's almost time to get gaming. It is literally just the power supply to go. And once again, as a reminder, this power supply is a little bit over-spec'd for this system. I'd probably go for a 750 for this, but again, depends obviously what you're going to upgrade to and obviously what you want to prioritize. This particular one is also from Corsair RM850E, but there's quite a few brands, personally speaking, that I trust, but I've used like Corsair power supplies for ages, and as far as I know, I haven't had any real issues. I think there was one, it's a water-cooled system, and I don't know whether it's the power supply that's causing the system to turn off or something else I've done. That's still under investigation, but yeah, Corsair power supplies I've been using for years, they're pretty good. But MSI make good ones as well, Seasonic, loads essentially. But obviously always look at the individual one, the reviews and how they perform essentially. But you'll notice that this doesn't have any cables pre-attached. This is actually not normal for a power supply. It kind of is in PC gaming, but most power supplies are called non-modular, which means everything is pre-attached and it saves you money. The benefit of having a modular power supply is that you only need to plug in the cables that you actually need, which neatens everything up. It potentially means in the future that you can get different cables, whether that's ones that look better, or if there's a new standard that's brought in, sometimes they will bring out like adapters, like Corsair for PCI Generation 5. They brought out these adaptation cables that could be plugged in, which were pretty cool. But it is just nice to not have the cables in your rig that you don't need. But it's a good illustration here to show you what we need. I'll get this the right way up. You can see our motherboard cables. It's a little bit weird. I still don't really know why to this day, but you have different connections here sometimes than you do actually in your PC. I think it's a good thing because it then means you can't accidentally plug the wrong side of the cable into the wrong thing, but a lot of them look quite similar. So motherboard will plug in here. It really is very straightforward, but do make sure that it is pushed in all the way so that it clicks and you've double checked the safety and security of these, because quite often, and I have had real life examples of this where I've had friends calling me saying that their PC doesn't work. They're getting really upset, really stressed. They didn't take a time out and a cup of tea, but it did just turn out that the power connections weren't actually properly inserted into their power supply. So that's why I say always double check all your connections as you go. On this particular one, because it's an NVIDIA GPU, we do need one of these, which is a PCI Generation 5 connection. If you don't have one, then you may well have an adapter inside the box with your graphics card that you can use, but these will plug in where it says PCIe/CPU. And speaking of CPU, obviously we'll need our CPU connection for the motherboard. Remember what I said, you've got an 8-pin here, which is what most rigs need, but you'll find that some will be 2 8-pins or 8 and 4, depending on the CPU that you're using. They're also labeled as well, so this is one of the ones that looks very similar on here as it does when you actually get to the motherboard. So look at the labels, and the side that says CPU, that actually goes to your board. And then here the plain side goes into the power supply. And then remember that our case actually has that baked in RGB and had that little dangling SATA connection. So we do need to plug one of these into our power supply so we can actually obviously meet it at the other end. These are typically used for hard drives, SATA SSDs, or most third-party hubs will actually connect with a SATA connection. But while the case that we're using today uses SATA, the hub actually uses a PCIe because that can do more power. It's quite rare though, it's only really Corsair that does this. This is what one of these PCIes looks like, by the way. You'll notice that it can actually be split. So you have 6 or 8, and depending on, that camera's died, depending on the graphics card that you're using, it might have a 6-pin, it might have an 8, it might have a combination of multiple, but they should just pull apart like this. And just like other side of your CPU, if you need a 4-pin, then that usually detaches, look. So you don't, I'm looking at that one again, it's died. You don't need to worry too much about it. You can just like split them and then use them like that. So let's get our final PCIe installed, shall we? And then we should be ready to actually get this in our PC. And as I say, this is the last thing that we need to do. Now, depending on the case, now NZXT cases, the new ones, these are the ones that are a little bit different, but most case, you want to get your power supply, find the fan, which is where obviously it's going to be able to breathe from, and then make sure it lines up with the vents on your system, which is usually downwards. So most cases, 95%, you want these facing downwards, but the new NZXT ones, as I say, you usually want to do the opposite on those, but check your case, and then you literally just pour that into position. And then when we give this a spin round, you should see that there are some holes on the back of your case, and these need to obviously line up with the power supply. And you also have this on-off switch. You may as well just turn this on now, because otherwise when your PC doesn't work, you might wonder why. But cutting back to our good old friend B-roll, you want to find the hex screws that either come with your power supply or the case, and then you can just grab them on the end of your screwdriver and then secure your power supply down. Oh, and then ladies and gentlemen, you should now be pretty much ready to go. There's nothing else you need to put inside this. You literally just need to wire up the last few cables, and it really is very straightforward. I promise you've done harder things throughout this video. You just literally need to grab this really thick ATX, and then you put this at the top. Then you grab the one that says CPU, and this can go all the way at the top right. And this is that cable that if you're using, as I say, a shorter case, I would advise putting this into your motherboard before you put your cooler in. Then you've got your ATX3 or your PCI Generation 5, depending on what you want to call it. Again, this single 16-pin connection for the graphics card. Oh no, what am I saying? This is a 5060 Ti. It uses an 8-pin. There is no 16. I'm getting carried away. This is probably a good thing for the video though, because as I say, different graphics cards have different connections. And if you're using an NVIDIA RTX 5070 or above, then it will almost certainly come with a 16-pin power connection, which is that single cable. But because we're using a 5060 Ti, then we want a PCI 8-pin, just like we need for that Corsair hub. So let's pretend that didn't happen and just carefully remove this and swap it out. No one would have noticed. So there you go then, living proof that even I make mistakes. It's easily done, but easily rectified too. The next thing we need to do is just to plug in these little SATA connections. These, well, I say SATA connections, it's just the single one, isn't it? For that RGB, there's only one right way of doing this, so if it's the wrong way, just give it a little wiggle. and then that should fit in just like that. And then any cables, once you're done with them, you can tidy them up by obviously clamping them down or just kind of stuffing them a little bit out of the way, out of sight, out of mind. If you can't see them, should be absolutely fine. And then last, but certainly not least, this side, we do have that power connection look for the Corsair hub. So we can just use one single 6-pin. Again, remember we've split that 8 into a 6, push that in till it clicks. And then from this side, I will tidy it up, but for now, we are pretty much all good to go, which means last, but certainly not least, we obviously need to plug in the cables this side. So for our graphics card, it is one 8-pin. Some GPUs you will need a daisy chain, but this one, look, just a single connection that we can push in and then tuck in and neaten like that. And then we can come round to the top, look, and our ATX just inserts like so. And then our final cable, look, and I'm very excited about this one, is the CPU. And again, this is gonna get a little bit tight if you've got a shorter case, but it should be okay on this. Cable's a little bit twisted, so we just need to move this round and then give it a wiggle and a push, and that should click into position. And then, ladies and gentlemen, there you are. We don't know it works yet. We've got one cable, look, to tidy up. But beside that, I think we are pretty much good to go. I told you it was straightforward and simple, because even if you do make mistakes, as I say, you realize what you've done and you just go back and you redo it, and okay, it might take you an afternoon, but especially if there's two of you, should be relatively stress-free. And obviously if you've gone for all of the parts that we're using here, you can follow along almost precisely at home, just like don't make that mistake with the cable. But if you're building other parts, which let's be honest, you probably are, then the good news is that for the most part, it's all exactly the same. It's only that Corsair bit, there's a little bit proprietary. Sometimes the mounting with the coolers obviously is a little bit different. The cables for the graphics card, you know, small things like that, but the whole process is the same. It doesn't matter the brand of motherboard as well. Like all of the ports, they might be like different amounts of them, but the ports are all the same standards, as long as obviously it supports that standard. So there's not really too much to worry about. It's a nice, easy process. Just cable manage as you go, just to try and make it nice and neat, because at the moment, this is looking not exactly fantastic, is it? Whereas if I had been kind of tucking these throughout the video, rather than being very conscious that that camera was going to run out of storage, then this would have been a whole lot easier. But the thing I like about this case as well is that obviously you get this little panel that in theory, once you put that back into position, can obviously help to kind of hide some of these cables and any oddities essentially. So there's a lot more work we can do, but before you do any of that, because that is one of the other mistakes people make, they're be way too aggressive with the cable management. They've got to get it perfect before you've tested that it works. And then if something doesn't work, you have to pull it all apart and you're just going to be tearing your hair out. So instead, before we cable manage, let's see if it works. And your best bet for this, and I know it's going to sound like I'm joking, but I'm dead serious, is to grab yourself a PC monitor specifically. Now, a TV should be fine, but the reason I say this is because my first ever build, besides the power button being plugged into power LED rather than power switch, I was actually plugging it into a TV that didn't support the signal that gets sent from your computer to your screen when you're in the motherboard. So everything was working, but I didn't know this because the display was completely black and I didn't know. And it was only when I changed, I think, to a different cable, or might have actually been to a different display, that I could see everything was working properly, and then I could set everything up and then go back to use the television I was using and it would just work, but it just wouldn't work in the BIOS. So for that reason, if you have a monitor, it does help, but obviously by all means try a TV. But be aware if it's just getting a black signal but everything else seems to be working fine, it could be your display that's a problem. And speaking of display output, by the way, one of the key and biggest mistakes that I see people make when they're plugging in their computer and then thinking that the whole thing doesn't work is that they've actually grabbed their HDMI or DisplayPort cable and then they've come along and they've found it on their motherboard, look, and they've connected it like that to the monitor, turn it on, nothing happens. Why? I've plugged it in. Well, actually, it's because instead of plugging the display into the motherboard, you have to plug it into the graphics card, because the CPUs, or at least a lot of them, will have what we call integrated GPUs. And if you plug into the motherboard, you're expecting that to output. But this often gets automatically shut off when you plug in a discrete graphics card. And then what you're supposed to do is plug into this, and then the graphics card is going to go to your display. Sometimes you'll find that you might get a display output and it kind of will work if you plug into your motherboard, but that would still be misconfigured and wouldn't give you like the optimum refresh rate and optimum experience. So you always want to plug in to the graphics card at the bottom. But let's get that hooked up, plugged into power. We're going to plug in a keyboard and a mouse, but nothing else. And then of course, the single most important thing of this whole video, you need to grab yourself a PC-centric mouse mat from pccentric.store, or find the link down below. This thing is in a clearance sale. Once it's gone, it's gone. It would really help out the channel if you've enjoyed this video. And if you're new to PC gaming, you get something that looks fantastic. And this is always the big question, isn't it? The moment of truth. You should hear a little whir. You should start to see like some RGB slowly coming to life. Usually the fans don't light up straight away. There's a bit of a delay on it. But if you press your button and nothing happens, at least wait like 10 seconds before you panic. Then obviously if it doesn't light up, you can check all of your connections. And then the next stage is you've got to hope that you see a series of lights here. A white LED at the top right is usually a good sign. And then assuming that your monitor's actually plugged into power, which obviously I've forgotten to do so, you then should see something come up on your display. That's 2 mistakes I've made in this video now. Should we try again? Hopefully this time we are going to get an output. We've spent a lot of time on this. It's going to be, as I say, a lot of stress if you're kind of building this from scratch and you haven't done it before, but good things come to those who wait. And ladies and gentlemen, there it is. You have now created your, well, could be your second, but your first gaming PC. And when you've got this like display output, you know, for the most part at least, that it should work properly. If you don't get this far, as I say, you're just going to check your cable connections, have a look at any error codes that appear on your PC. In fact, if you want to see a full video that goes through every reason why your PC won't boot, you can find it in the top right corner of your screen. You can watch this before you get your parts so you know what you're doing, or obviously watch it after, bookmark it in case you need it. But yes, if you can see this screen, that is a great result. What you need to do now is just press F1 on your keyboard, then you'll enter this, which is the BIOS, and then you'll see a screen like this. Depends on the motherboard that you're using. If it's like Gigabyte, MSI, ASRock, it will obviously look slightly different, but essentially this is where you can control your motherboard. So you can change like the fan speed, you can turn like your RAM overclocking on. The way we do this is where it says Expo, we're gonna set this to enabled, and then the PC will restart once we've saved and exited with all of the changes. And then assuming it works properly, sometimes it won't and you have to reverse this, then your RAM will then run at its full rated speed rather than the slower base speed that it will just run by for safety essentially. But I would advise that you do tune your fans, so just go into your fan tuning utility. Here it's called Q-Fan Control. Just make sure you set everything to silent essentially. But actually where we're using the Corsair fans, we need to tune these in the software rather than in the utility. But for most people, this will control all of your fans. Once you've done that though, really simple and straightforward, you just need to grab yourself a copy of Windows. I've made a full video that walks you through how to do this. Find it in the top right corner of your screen. But essentially, you just grab Windows on a USB flash drive by downloading it on a different computer. Then you whack this in the back of your system. Then you can just turn it off, restart, and then follow the instructions, and then you'll be away. And then, ladies and gentlemen, you've got everything set up. Your gaming PC is complete. And the story doesn't stop there. If you want to see exactly what you need to do next, how to set up your PC for all of the best experiences and to obviously play like I would, I suppose, you can find that video again in the top right corner of your screen or link down below that will go through all of the best practices to set up a gaming PC from scratch. As I say, thanks for watching this video, smash the like button, get yourself subscribed, and if you do want to check out current pricing on anything that was featured in this video, you can find that listed down below with our affiliate links for all of these parts and similar parts. And once again, a massive thank you to Overclockers UK for sponsoring this video. It's really helpful, and if you do want to grab PC parts in the UK, then they are absolutely one of the best places to go. And as I say, that next day delivery really can be incredibly helpful. But thank you guys so much. We'll catch you in the next one.